Today I am going to take you into a realm of history that is as fascinating as it is troubling. What life was like for male concubines in the Ottoman Empire. The norms, the daily realities, the horrors that were considered normal back then. This isn't easy stuff, but it's important because understanding how people lived, how power and cruelty were intertwined, gives us insight into how far society has come and how much we should remember. I'll try to describe this with enough detail to paint a clear picture, but also in a way that's accessible, so stay with me. Picture the Ottoman imperial court at its height. Imagine the Topkapi palace, the harem, the sultan, the court officials, eunuchs, and the concubines. Let's focus on male concubines, known, in some sources, by terms like tragically, though those had more specific connotations, or simply those taken for intimate purposes, sometimes even trained performers. They were often young boys, sometimes teenagers. Some were slaves, others captives from wars, others brought from far lands. Many were castrated. Yes, that's one of the first features we need to talk about. Castration was often performed so the males couldn't impregnate anyone, to supposedly protect the lineage and security of the sultan. This procedure was brutal, unregulated, dangerous. Many died from complications, bleeding, infection. Those who survived were marked by bodily change, lifelong consequences, both physical loss of reproductive capacity, hormonal changes, risk of infection, difficulty walking or sitting, depending on how it was done, and psychological trauma. It's horrifying by modern standards. By the standards of that time, gruesome, but seen by many in the court as normal, necessary, even imperative. Once in the court, a male concubine wasn't just there for sexual service. Sometimes they performed, danced, sang, played musical instruments, entertained. Training was rigorous. They were expected to be visually appealing, groomed, dressed in fine fabrics, with ornamentation, jewels, makeup, intricate hairstyles perhaps. Their design, so to speak, was curated. Beauty, grace, zero objection from those in power. Appearance was not superficial because the body was one way power was displayed. Think of design elements in that sense. Fine silks, vivid dyes, elaborate jewelry, perfumes. These young men had to maintain their appearance, probably wearing clothing that restricted movement, glimmering with embellishments, but also possibly uncomfortable under heat or in crowded courtyards. Their performative aspect meant they had to move with grace, dance, sing, be entertaining while wearing these outfits. Under scrutiny, possibly knowing that any mistake could mean punishment. Another feature of their life, the constant surveillance. They were always watched by eunuchs, by court officials, by the sultan's favorites. Their behavior, speech, gesture all had to conform. Mistakes could lead to humiliation, physical punishment, or worse. They had almost no privacy. Their lives, insofar as they existed, were not their own. Diet, living quarters, privileges. Those varied, depending on status. A favored male concubine might live in luxurious quarters with good food, be given education, musical training. But that didn't erase the brutal reality. They were still property. Free movement was limited. Their identity and autonomy were so. For many, the day-to-day was fear. Fear of illness, fear of punishment, fear of rejection or disgrace. Another performance aspect. Emotional labor. These concubines were expected not only to entertain physically and artistically, but to provide companionship, to soothe the moods of powerful men, to respond to the sultan's or palace officials' whims. They had to appear joyful, graceful, pliant, to be amused when humor was demanded, to be sorrowful when mourning was demanded, to be available when desire called. All of this while suppressing their own feelings, often hiding pain, longing, homesickness. In terms of performance in a more metaphorical sense, they performed obedience, submission, beauty. They were crafted, selected, trained, even altered, through castration or grooming, or perhaps cosmetic practices, to fulfill roles. So the idea of design elements, here isn't about architecture, it's about how people are designed, shaped, molded. Let's talk timeline. At what ages, what stages? Boys taken, usually prepubescent or early adolescence. Castration often when young, so that physical features, voice, etc., would be changed. Then subjected to training, dance, music, perhaps languages. Then introduced gradually to the court, to entertain, to serve, maybe as companions. Some rose to high status, gained power or influence, though always within constrained limits. But many died young. From disease, from infection, from stress, from violence. It was a precarious existence. Diseases. Because of hygiene then, because surgical procedures were rudimentary, because the stress and psychological trauma were constant, these individuals were vulnerable to many illnesses. Also, nutrition might be rich for some, but exposure, overwork, overuse, lack of rest might undercut those advantages. Injuries from physical punishment, from dance or performance accidents, from the wear of tight shoes, heavy clothing. One of the unique selling points, so to speak, of this system, what made it persist, and what made it finis, the way power leveraged beauty. The system depended on combining attraction with control. The concubine was appealing in appearance, voice, manner, yet entirely in service of the sultan's desires and whims. That tension between visible beauty and hidden suffering is central. Its performance in its purest, most tragic form. Another design feature: invisibility and silence. The concubines were expected to be discreet, their presence known, their acts perhaps secret. They were to be seen when it suited, but otherwise to fade. They had to cultivate silence, especially about personal trauma. They couldn't complain, they couldn't leave. So resilience, endurance, coping mechanisms were necessary. Also, there was hierarchy. Not all male concubines were equal. Some were more favored, got better quarters, better food, more freedom within limits. Others had lesser status, more harsh lives. This hierarchy meant that performance wasn't just about pleasing the sultanate, was also about navigating palace politics, currying favor, avoiding jealousy, surviving intrigue. This high-stakes environment imposed psychological stress. When we examine the performance aspects, how well they danced, how melodic their voice, how pleasing their mannerisms, these were not superficial. They were integral to survival. A male concubine who was mediocre could be punished, sidelined, or worse. One who excelled could gain small privileges, more comfort, perhaps influence. But always safety was fragile. Let's pull back a bit. How people of that period justified these horrific norms. Power, religion, culture, tradition, all entwined. Slavery was accepted in many societies. Concubinage, particularly in royal courts, was seen as part of maintaining luxury, authority, and the absolutely central figure of the ruler. The breeding of heirs mattered. Maintaining exclusivity of lineage mattered. So everything castration, rigorous control, selection served a structure of power. Design. Also, in that sense, the palace itself, the architecture, the politics, the norms, everything is designed to cultivate this system. The concubines are pieces in a larger design. To uphold the sultan's prestige, to produce heirs, or to entertain. To manifest power by surrounding himself with beautiful, exotic, disciplined people. Some of the worst features that were normalized: sexual exploitation, physical abuse, psychological trauma, lack of consent since many were enslaved, or brought from childhood, being subject to arbitrary decisions who you danced for, when you were punished, what you wore. Also, castration wasn't just physical, it altered identity deeply. The loss of possibility to have a family, to be seen as fully masculine in many cultural senses, to have normal bodily functions. Hormonal disruptions could lead to fatigue, weakness, psychological issues. In terms of agency, very little. Some concubines who gained favor could exercise a bit more power, interact with high officials, influence decisions, gain gifts or land, but even then it was fragile, always dependent on being pleasing, always precarious. A fall from grace was immediate. Trust was rare. Betrayal, jealousy, suspicion often led to punishment, exile, or worse. Another thing to consider: death and disposal. Since these individuals were in a system where their value was tied to beauty, performance, novelty, aging could be cruel. Once youth and charm faded, if health failed, the status dropped. Some were discarded or neglected. Sometimes care was withdrawn. Sometimes they died, neglected, or from illness without proper attention. Their value was entirely instrumental. Yet, even with all that, the human dimension persists. Some would form friendships, solidarity. Some would mentor younger boys. Some found pleasure in performative art, music, dancing, creatively expressing themselves. Some developed mental resilience, strategies to cope. These aspects show that even within oppressive systems, human beings find ways to persist, to adapt. That doesn't justify the system, it highlights resilience. Understanding all that also forces us to think about ethics, about how we treat people in systems of power. It prompts comparisons with modern abuses, trafficking, child exploitation, coerced labor, even aesthetic industries that demand conformity. It shows that seeming normal changes depending on social power structures, culture, available technology. Technically speaking, if we think of features, performance, design, the design of the institution was all about control. From physical design, palace layout, living quarters, security, to social design hierarchies, eunuchs oversight, rules of behavior. Performance metrics for concubines included appearance, obedience, skill, talent in arts, capacity to entertain. Those who performed better got better food, rest, privileges. Those who failed, punishment. Some of the punishments could be corporal, humiliating whipping, forced labor, deprivation. From a production standpoint, one might even think of the process. Capture or purchase gives castration, gives grooming. Training gives final display or function. Very calculated, but with huge risks all along. Let me describe a hypothetical day. A young male concubine awakens early. Perhaps the quarters are shared, perhaps small or cramped. He dresses, robes heavy with embroidery, jewelry, perhaps perfume, hairstyled, then training, dance practice, voice rehearsal, music lessons, after that, attending to duties, entertaining visitors, attending court functions, possibly being called upon for the Sultan's private hour. Food might be fine, but scheduled, controlled. Any misstep could bring admonishment from eunuchs. Rest might be minimal. Health issues perhaps ignored. Emotional life suppressed. Nights, perhaps other duties. Always under gaze. Contrast. A favorite might be allowed more comfort, better clothing, more attention, possibility to petition for small favors, but always under threat. Also, worth noting the legal and cultural context. Ottoman law and Islamic jurisprudence had complex views about slavery, concubinage, castration. Some religious scholars condemned some practices. Others tolerated them as part of royal prerogative. But that didn't translate into protection or rights for concubines. They were property in many senses. Their welfare secondary to court politics. Some unique selling points, unique aspects that set this system apart. The degree of institutionalization. This wasn't ad hoc or marginal. It was embedded in palace life, in court ritual, in politics, the aesthetics, the beauty standards, the performances, the artistry expected, the control over body, voice, movement, also, the ambiguity. These concubines were not purely slaves. In some cases, they gained wealth, influence, gifts. Sometimes they were educational tools. Sometimes in diplomatic shows, foreign dignitaries would be shown the court, the beauty of dress, performance, including the concubines. So they were visible, part of spectacle. Then there's the emotional horror. Loss of identity, isolation, fear, trauma all normalized. The design of mental suppression. You could not grieve, could not revolt. You had to survive with your pain. That psychological dimension is often underemphasized but crucial. In terms of modern resonance, this history forces us to ask, what do power, aesthetic beauty, youth fetishization, submission, consent mean? It pushes us to look at how modern systems, media, entertainment, even beauty industries sometimes replicate horrifying norms under the guise of glamour. Also, when we talk about performance, there's physical cost. Injuries from dance, muscle strain, maybe deformities caused by constraints of clothing or posture. Voice training, sometimes damaging if forced. The tools were rudimentary. Medical care poor. Pain and illness frequent. In design terms, what kind of clothing, ornamentation, jewels, fabrics like silk, velvet, dyes made from plants. Embroidery, metallic threads, maybe jewels, like pearls, emeralds, rubies, perfumes made from flowers, musk, attar oils. The room decorations, luxurious carpets, cushions, lanterns, light, scent, color all part of making the concubine's presence pleasant, sensuous. Also to impress visitors, to reinforce the sultan's wealth. Then grooming. Bathing routines, skincare, perhaps hairdressing, removal of unwanted hair, cosmetic oils, powders, nails trimmed, hands pampered. These things cost resources, time, staff. So being a concubine could bring material luxury, but it came at great cost and always with dependency. Performance could also mean that the male concubine might be asked to dance publicly or semi-publicly, sometimes in mixed gatherings, other times for private entertainment. That meant training in dance styles, in perhaps regional or courtly dances. Also, reproduction of beauty ideals. Smooth skin, symmetrical face, delicate hands. Any deviation could result in being devalued. Sometimes the concubines were used for diplomatic or symbolic purposes, gift exchanges, showing off exotic people, using them to enhance prestige of the sultan. That meant that some male concubines came from faraway lands, Africa, Balkans, Caucasus, and their exoticness was part of what made them valuable. But that also meant dislocation. New languages, new culture, isolation. Let me delve into one performance metric. Voice. The voice mattered a lot. Singing, reciting poetry, reading, speaking in certain tones. Castration sometimes aimed to preserve a higher voice, though it came at cost. Voice control was painstakingly trained. Breathing, pronunciation, perhaps knowledge of poetry, literary culture. Those able to recite fluent Persian or Arabic poetry might earn greater favor. Another metric, dancing. Court dances were not casual. They involved gestures, rhythm, precise movements. The boys would rehearse for hours. The music often complex. And costumes for dance-heavy. Perhaps they had to dance while balancing weights or wearing certain shoes or anklets that jingled. All part of spectacle. In the end, though no matter how beautiful or polished, concubines were expendable. Their function defined their value. As they aged, as their beauty faded, as tastes changed, as political tides shifted, they could be dismissed, neglected, punished, or worse. One more thing. Psychological manipulation. The concubines were often pitted against each other, made to feel jealousy, competition, insecurity. The palace hierarchy encouraged rivalry. Also, from the outside, concubines had no legal recourse. They depended entirely on the favor of those above them. That power dynamic was exploitative at every level. In terms of historical sources, many of what's known comes from court chronicles, travelogues by foreign diplomats or visitors, court records, sometimes personal letters. These are biased, partial, often romanticizing or demonizing. So while we try to reconstruct the horror, we should also be aware that some sources underplay suffering, others exaggerate. But the consensus among historians is that many things that by modern ethics are deeply wrong were routine then. So when we look back, what stands out most is how normalized such suffering was. Young boys being castrated, people being treated as objects of beauty, control over every bodily function, performing obedience, living under constant surveillance, no privacy, emotional and physical abuse accepted as part of life. Yet also, beauty, music, artistry, luxury, interwoven with cruelty. The palace is gorgeous in descriptions, but the beauty hides the pain. This history is not just about exotic cruelty. It's about power, about what happens when some people have total control over others' bodies. It's about how systems can sanitize atrocity by embedding it in ritual, tradition, prestige. We can't excuse it, but understanding it helps us recognize what human dignity demands, and how fragile it can be under systems of power.